Hello, everybody. I'm taking Anurag's place today as he is away for personal reasons. Please do not make fun of me for trying to sound as interesting as he does in the comments. So, in today's episode, I'll talk about 3 interesting stories. I first talk about a European carbon tax that can threaten the Indian steel industry. I then discuss some interesting details from Bajaj's quarterly results and whether they will overtake Ola. And finally, I talk about major trends in the energy sector for 2024. Welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha, where our aim is to simplify the biggest news in the financial markets in a way that's one level deeper as compared to news channels. I'm your host Tarun. Today is Friday, October 18th. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you consume your podcast. If you prefer video, you can listen along with interesting charts on YouTube. And if you like reading instead of watching or listening, you can sign up for our No Spam newsletter for a quick rundown. All the links will be in the comments. Let's start with the first story on how a European carbon tax can threaten the Indian steel industry. Climate change is a pressing issue, and reducing carbon emissions is crucial if we want to avoid its worst effects. Industrial activity, in particular, is responsible for over 25% of global carbon emissions, and countries around the world are tackling the problem in different ways. The European Union is taking one of the most ambitious steps with its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism or CBAM tax, which will be fully operational by 2026. Now, I know the word tax can make you switch off, but stick with me. This one has big implications, especially for India. Let's break down what CBAM is and why it's such a big deal. In simple terms, CBAM is a tax on carbon-intensive goods imported into the European Union, such as steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, and electricity. It's designed to address something called carbon leakage. This happens when companies move their production to countries with less strict environmental rules to avoid paying carbon taxes at home. The European Union is trying to level the playing field by applying this tax on imported goods. This way, foreign companies will have to pay the same amount for their carbon emissions as European Union-based companies do now through the Emissions Trading System or ETS. Here's how it works. European Union companies have to pay for their carbon emissions through the ETS, a system where businesses buy carbon credits. These credits allow them to emit a set amount of CO2, and if they emit less, they can sell their extra credits to other companies. The ETS creates a financial incentive to reduce emissions. Now, CBAM extends this concept to imports. So, companies outside the EU, like those in India, will need to buy certificates covering the emissions generated when producing goods they sell in Europe. For a major exporter like India, this has big consequences. Let's take steel as an example. If an Indian company like JSW Steel exports steel to Europe, they'll have to purchase CBAM certificates to cover the carbon emitted during the production. Since India doesn't currently have a carbon pricing system like the EU, this tax will raise the cost of exporting steel to Europe, making Indian goods less competitive. To give you a sense of scale, in 2022 alone, 27% of India's steel, iron, and aluminum exports worth $8.2 billion were shipped to Europe. Once CBAM kicks in, these exports could face higher costs, and Indian companies might struggle to maintain their market share in the EU. Indian steelmakers like JSW and Tata Steel are already taking steps to prepare. JSW is investing in a 4 million ton green steel unit, and Tata Steel is working on reducing emissions with the help of its power division, Tata Power. However, much of India's steel industry still depends on coal-based production, which is highly carbon intensive. This reliance on coal means that many Indian companies will face significant challenges under the new EU rules. India's government has voiced strong objections to CBAM. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has called the EU standard irrational and described CBAM as a barrier that unfairly targets developing countries. According to India's economic survey, the policy goes against the Paris Agreement's principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which recognizes that developing countries like India shouldn't be held to the same standards as industrialized nations because they're at a different stage of development. This highlights a broader issue. While Europe is leading the way in climate action, developing countries like India are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Transitioning to greener technologies is not only complex but also expensive. India needs an estimated $28 billion per year to meet its net zero target by 2070. But international climate finance has been limited, forcing the country to rely on domestic resources. This adds even more financial pressure to industries already struggling with rising costs. The steel sector is expected to be one of the hardest hit by CBAM, given its high carbon intensity. Steel production in India largely relies on coal-based technologies like blast furnaces, which emit significant amounts of CO2. Under CBAM, Indian steel will be taxed based on these emissions, making it more expensive to sell in Europe. This could lead to a projected 10.5% decline in exports, with other sectors like aluminium and cement likely to be affected as well. Upgrading to greener production methods, such as using hydrogen-based steel production, is one solution, but it requires massive investment and will take time. Many Indian companies may find it difficult to make this transition in short term, which puts them at a disadvantage compared to their European counterparts. But this issue isn't just about trade. There are also geopolitical and economic factors to consider. While the EU argues that CBAM is necessary to meet global climate goals, many developing countries see it as a form of protectionism designed to shield European industries from competition under the guise of environmental policy. There's a fear that CBAM could create a climate club, where wealthy nations can afford to trade in green certified goods, while developing countries still dependent on carbon-heavy industries are left out. For India, the stakes are high. CBAM adds another level of complexity to its already challenging task of balancing economic growth with decarbonization. Rising production costs, coupled with the need to invest in cleaner technologies, could put Indian industries in a difficult position, caught between the demands of EU regulations and their own financial constraints. India has been vocal about the need for more support from developed countries, both in terms of finance and technology, to help ease this transition. But with international climate finance falling short, India has largely had to fund its own efforts to tackle climate change. As CBAM's implementation draws closer, the financial burden on Indian industries will only grow, making it harder for them to compete globally while also meeting the country's climate commitments. In conclusion, CBAM is set to reshape global trade, but for India, it represents both an economic and political challenge. While Europe sees it as a necessary step to curb emissions, India views it as yet another obstacle in its development journey. Without sufficient financial and technological support, India's path to a greener future and its ability to compete in the international market could be seriously compromised. Now, with that said, let's move on to the second story. Will Bajaj overtake Ola? That's a question a lot of people are asking as the electric vehicle or EV market in India heats up. To understand the dynamics between these two companies, we need to look at Bajaj Auto, a major player in the two- and three-wheeler markets, not just in India, but worldwide. They are actually the largest manufacturer of three-wheelers globally, and their sales, particularly in the two-wheeler segment, are a good indicator of how the local economy is doing. When rural incomes rise, say after a strong monsoon, demand for two-wheelers tends to go up, especially in farming communities. Bajaj recently released their quarterly results, and while the headline numbers are impressive, there's more going on beneath the surface that's worth paying attention to. For example, their revenue hit a record high this quarter, 13,128 crores, up 21.1% from the previous year. That's strong growth, mostly due to a strong domestic market and more exports. But while revenues jumped, their profit after tax, aka PAT, dipped slightly, down by 0.7% to 2005 crores. Does that sound worrying? Not really. This drop was due to a one-time tax adjustment, so it's more of a technical detail rather than a reflection of any performance issues. In fact, Bajaj is positioning itself strongly for the future, particularly in the EV space, which is where things get really interesting. Their push into electric vehicles is becoming a major part of the story. EVs now contribute 20% to Bajaj's domestic revenue, a big achievement for a company traditionally focused on petrol-powered two- and three-wheelers. Take their electric scooter Chetak, for example. Launched in early 2020, it started off small, available in only two cities, Pune and Bangalore. But Bajaj didn't stop there. Over the past few years, they've steadily increased production and expanded its availability. By March 2023, they were selling around 3,000 units of Chetak per month. Fast forward to a year later, and that number has jumped to 16,000 per month. In the final quarter of financial year 24 alone, Bajaj sold nearly 40,000 units of Chetak, their best quarter yet. That's a huge leap, driven by an expanded sales network and continuous innovation. By the end of financial year 24, Chetak had captured a 13% share of the electric two-wheeler market, up from just 5% at the start of the year. In total, they sold over 1 lakh Chetak units in financial year 24, almost 4 times what they sold the previous year. Their growth has positioned Bajaj as a serious competitor to Ola Electric. Right now, Ola leads the market with a 35% share, but Bajaj isn't far behind, holding 21%. Bajaj is investing heavily in its EV portfolio, with more launches on the way, and their multi-fuel strategy gives them an additional edge. Let's not forget about Bajaj's dominance in the three-wheeler segment, where they hold a 35% share of the electric three-wheeler market. They only entered the space a year ago, but they're already making significant strides. There are plans to introduce new electric three-wheeler models later this year between November 2024 and Jan 2025, further solidifying their position. Bajaj's strategy isn't limited to electric and CNG either. They're experimenting with other alternative fuels like ethanol and even compressed biogas or CBG, giving them a broader range of options as the market evolves. One notable example is their Freedom 125 CNG bike, which is the world's first CNG-powered motorcycle. Launched in July 2023, it's already seen a strong response, with 10,000 units sold by September and another 18,000 expected in October. So where does this leave Bajaj in comparison to Ola? Ola still leads in electric two-wheelers, but Bajaj is gaining ground quickly. Their multi-fuel approach might give them a flexibility advantage, allowing them to cater to different customer needs in a way that could be more sustainable in the long run. While Ola is focusing heavily on EVs, Bajaj is balancing between electric and alternative fuels, potentially making them more resilient to shifts in the market. Now, let's move on to the final story and discuss the major trends in the energy sector. Energy is one of those things we take for granted, but it powers almost everything we do. Whether it's driving to work, running a business, or even living off the grid, energy is at the heart of it. It's not just a commodity, it's essential. Without it, life as we know it would come to a halt. That's why the future of energy is so important. Every year, the International Energy Agency or IEA releases its World Energy Outlook, a report that offers insights into global energy trends, helping us understand where the industry is headed. The 2024 edition is out, and it sheds light on both immediate and long-term trends. Let's start with the near term. Right now, about 75% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, that is oil, gas, and coal. But the IEA warns that these sources are facing increasing uncertainty. Geopolitical tensions like those in the Middle East pose serious risks. Take the Strait of Hormuz, for example. It's a narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas or LNG passes. Any disruption here could have a huge ripple effect, much like what we saw with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where global energy markets were thrown into turmoil. These kinds of disruptions aren't new, and they won't be the last. To prepare for such shocks, IEA member countries are required to maintain a strategic reserve of oil equal to 90 days of the previous year's import. This safety net helps stabilize markets when crises hit, though it's mainly net importing countries that need this buffer. But the bigger story is what's happening over the medium term. The shift towards clean energy has picked up serious momentum. In 2023 alone, a staggering $2 trillion was invested in clean energy, nearly double the amount spent on fossil fuels. And this investment is beginning to reshape the energy landscape. According to the IEA, by 2035, all new growth in energy demand could be met entirely by clean energy sources. If that happens, it would signal the beginning of the end for fossil fuel dominance, with demand for oil, gas, and coal peaking soon after. So what's driving this shift to clean energy? There are a few key factors. First, cost. Over the years, clean energy technologies have become much cheaper. By 2027, China alone is expected to produce enough solar panels to meet global demand twice over. And it's not just solar. The cost of wind turbines, battery storage, and electric vehicle batteries has dropped dramatically between 25% and 75% since 2015. This progress has mostly benefited wealthier nations and China, but it's a step in the right direction. The challenge now is making clean energy accessible to developing countries. The second big driver is electrification. Electricity demand has grown twice as fast as overall energy demand over the last decade. Interestingly, about two-thirds of this growth has come from China. A large part of the world's current oil consumption goes towards transportation, but as EVs become more widespread, we are seeing a gradual shift away from internal combustion engines. This electrification is transforming how we consume energy, accelerating the move towards cleaner sources. Despite all this growth, the IEA's report reminds us that we are still not on track to meet global climate targets. Current policies are setting us up for a 2.4 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures by 2100, which would bring significant risks as climate crisis worsens. While there's a lot of momentum behind clean energy, there's still a gap between where we are and where we need to be to limit these risks. Interestingly, we are seeing a shift in power dynamics within energy markets. For the first time in a long time, consumers, whether they're governments, businesses, or individuals, are starting to hold more influence. As clean energy options become more widely available and affordable, consumers aren't just stuck with fossil fuels anymore. This puts pressure on energy suppliers to adapt to growing demand for cleaner alternatives. Energy producers who fail to invest in sustainable solutions risk being left behind as customers increasingly opt for greener options. However, there's a potential downside if fossil fuel investments continue. If suppliers focus too much on short-term affordability of fossil-based energy, they could delay the transition to clean energy. And while fossil fuel prices might seem more manageable now, the IEA warns that energy markets are cyclical. Prices will rise again, making reliance on fossil fuels a riskier bet. On the other hand, clean energy technologies are becoming more cost-effective and resilient. Unlike fossil fuels, which are prone to price swings, renewable sources offer stability. The choices we make today will shape not only the future of the energy market, but also our ability to manage climate risks. As the IEA points out, delaying the transition to clean energy will only make the economic and environmental cost higher in the long run. In short, we're at a critical juncture. The shift to clean energy is gaining ground, but there's still work to be done to ensure a sustainable future. Governments, businesses, and consumers all have a role to play in pushing this transition forward. And the sooner we make that shift, the better position we'll be to avoid the risks that come with a warming planet. Let's now move to the final section of the day, which is the news tidbits. Blinkit has launched a 10-minute return and exchange service for clothing and footwear in select Indian cities, positioning itself as a direct competitor to Myntra and Ajio. This move could reshape the fashion e-commerce landscape by prioritizing convenience and speed. Gold prices reached a new record of 78,900 per 10 grams due to high demand and global uncertainties, as investors turn to gold as a safe haven asset amidst volatile markets and geopolitical tensions. The RBI's actions against 6 P2P lending platforms over regulatory violations have caused business volumes to drop by 95%, raising operational costs and threatening smaller players in the industry, potentially reshaping the P2P landscape. Indian Railways has implemented AI to improve seat allocation, increasing confirmed ticket rates by 30%. AI is also enhancing cleanliness checks and resource management, significantly improving passenger satisfaction and operational efficiency. And that's it for today's episode. We'll see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.